New Yorkers electing someone like Zohran Mamdani, who openly identifies with the democratic socialism and speaks positively about collectivist ideas, is not an accident or a sudden ideological revolution. It reflects specific social conditions, local realities, and how collectivism is being framed today. New York is one of the wealthiest cities in the world, but it also has extreme inequality. Rent is crushing, healthcare is expensive, student debt is high, and many people work long hours while barely getting by. One large number of people feel the system is stacked against them. Ideas about a collective solution become attractive. Collectivism in this context is understood less as an ideology and more as mutual protection, which means people pooling resources to survive in a harsh economic environment. Another reason is generational change. Young voters, especially millennials and Gen Z, grew up during the financial crisis, rising costs, climate anxiety, and declining trust in institutions. Many of them do not associate collectivist language with old authoritarian system. Instead, they associate it with healthcare, rent control, public transit, and climate action. To them, individualism often looks like abandonment rather than freedom. There is also strong delusionment with the market solutions. In theory, markets promise choice and efficiency. In practice, many New Yorkers see landlords, insurance companies, and corporations exercising enormous power over their lives. When private actors feel unaccountable, the idea of collectivism controls start to feel democratic rather than oppressive. Voting for a democratic socialist becomes a way of saying that we want some power back. Mamdani's appeal also lies in how he talks about collectivism. He frames it in moral terms, care, solidarity, and fairness, rather than abstract ideology. He speaks directly to lived experiences, eviction fears, medical bills, transit costs. This makes collectivism feel human and concrete, not theoretical. Voters are often responding less to socialism as a doctrine and more to a politician who seems to understand their struggles. In city and state level government, collectivist policies feel more manageable and less threatening. Public housing, tenant protection, free buses, or expanding public services do not require redesigning society from scratch. They feel like practical fixes, not grand experiments. People may reject collectivism at a national or global level, but still support it locally, where benefits are visible. And elections are often protests as much as endorsements. Voting for the Democratic Socialist can be a way to reject the political elite, corporate influence, and business as usual politics. It signals frustration with existing power structures more than full commitment to a comprehensive ideology. Collectivism is not dangerous at the level of shared responsibility, but at the point where the collective is elevated above the individual as a moral absolute. Collectivism is the idea that the interests of the group, whether defined as the state, the nation, the class, the race, or the community, take priority over individual interests. No society can function without some level of collective obligation. Laws, public infrastructure, taxation, defense, disaster response, and social norms all rely on individuals accepting limits on their personal freedom for shared benefits. In this sense, collectivism is not only unavoidable, it is a condition of civilization itself. The problem begins when collectivism stops being a practical coordination principle and becomes a total moral doctrine. When the collective is treated as more real, more valuable, or more sacred than individual persons, individual rights started to appear negotiable. At that point, dissent becomes betrayal, diversity becomes deviation, and coercion becomes justified for the greater good. This is where collectivism turns from social cooperation into political danger. Historically, the most extreme failures of collectivism occurred in the systems where the collective was embodied in a centralized authority that claimed exclusive knowledge of the common good. In Stalinist Soviet Union, Maoist China, and Pol Pot's Cambodia, collectivism justified mass repression, forced labor, famine, and purges. Individuals were reduced to the instruments of historical destiny or class struggle. The moral logic was chillingly simple. If the collective is everything, then the suffering of individuals is irrelevant. In practice, this meant that the abstract goals, which are industrial output, ideological purity, revolutionary progress, were valued more than human life. Even outside of totalitarian systems, collectivism can erode moral responsibility. When actions are justified as serving society, the people, or the movement, individuals are less likely to feel personally accountable for harm. Hannah Arendt famously described this phenomena as banality of evil. Ordinary people committing atrocities not out of hatred, but because they were fulfilling a collective role. Collectivist thinking makes it easier for the people to say, I was just doing my duty, rather than confronting the ethical weight of their actions. There is also a psychological cost. Strong collectivist cultures often suppress individuality, creativity, and dissent. When social harmony is valued above truth, criticism becomes taboo. Innovation slows not because people lack ideas, but because deviation carries social or political risk. Over time, this produces conformity, fear, and intellectual stagnation. Societies that cannot tolerate internal disagreement become brittle. They appear stable until they suddenly collapse. Collectivism under Stalin and Mao was fused with the absolute state power, ideological dogma, and coercion, destroying both economic rationality and human dignity. In both cases, the collective was not a living community of citizens, but an abstract entity embodied by the party and enforced by violence. Under Stalin, collectivism took its most brutal form in the forced collectivization of agriculture at the end of the 1920s and early 1930s. Millions of peasants were compelled to surrender their land, livestock, and tools to collective farms controlled by the state. This policy was justified ideologically as necessary for the socialist progress and industrialization, but in practice, it severed the link between labor, incentive, and reward. Peasants who had once worked for their own survival now worked under quotas imposed from above, with little control over output or distribution. Productivity collapsed. Food was requisitioned regardless of local conditions, leaving entire regions to starve. The resulting famine, most devastatingly in Ukraine, killed millions. Collectivism failed here because it replaced local knowledge and voluntary cooperation with bureaucratic command and terror. At the same time, Stalin's collectivism redefined class identity as destiny. The so-called kulaks were labeled enemies of collective, not because of what they did, but because of who they were perceived to be. Once a group was declared hostile to the collective, more restraints disappeared. Deportations, executions, and forced labor became legitimate tools of policy. The individual ceased to be existing as a right-bearing person and became either an asset or an obstacle to the collective plan. This logic reached its peak during the Great Purge, where loyalty to the collective was constantly tested and survival depended on conformity rather than competence or truth. The system devoured its own administrators, generals, and intellectuals, hollowing out the very state it sought to strengthen. Mao's China followed a strikingly similar pattern, most catastrophically during the Great Leap Forward between 1958 and 1962. Mao attempted to leapfrog economic development by collectivizing agriculture into massive people's communes and mobilizing the population for rapid industrialization. Traditional framing practices were abandoned in favor of ideologically approved methods that ignored ecological and agronomics realities. Local officials, fearing punishment, falsified production figures to demonstrate loyalty to the collective vision. The state, believing these inflated reports, extracted grain that did not exist. Villages were stripped of food, while dissenting voices were silenced as anti-collective or counter-revolutionary. The result was one of the worst famines in the history of humans, with tens of millions dying not from natural disaster, but from political design. What made Mao's collectivism particularly destructive was its fusion with mass mobilization and moral absolutism. Participation in collective campaigns was not merely economic, but ideological and emotional. People were expected to demonstrate revolutionary enthusiasm, often through public rituals, or denunciation and self-criticism. Truth became subordinate to loyalty. When survival depends on affirming the collective narrative, reality itself becomes negotiable. This epistemic collapse, where no one could safely tell the truth, made correction impossible even as the catastrophe unfolded. There was also a profound moral failure. By elevating the collective above the individual, these systems normalized sacrifice without consent. Human lives were treated as expendable inputs in a historical process, supposedly moving toward a higher goal. Once suffering could be justified in the name of the future, there was no internal limit to cruelty. The promise of a classless, harmonious society became a license for unlimited violence in the present. Economist Friedrich Hayek believed that collectivism fails because no one is smart enough to run an entire society from the top. Society is made up of millions of people, each with their own needs, skills, situations, and knowledge. This knowledge is scattered everywhere. A farmer knows his land, a shopkeeper knows her customers, a worker knows his tools. When a central authority tries to control everything, it cannot possibly know all these details. Important information gets lost. The market solves this problem in a simple way. Prices send signals. When something becomes scarce, its price rises, and people naturally adjust. No one needs to understand the whole system for it to work. Collectivism tries to replace this natural coordination with orders and plans. This breaks the system because planners are guessing instead of responding to real conditions. Another problem is choice. In a collective system, someone has to decide what matters most. Should resources go to one group or another? Should comfort be sacrificed for productivity? There is no neutral answer. Different people value different things. To make a single plan work, The state must force everyone to accept one set of priorities. That means people lose the freedom to choose how they live. Collectivism eventually leads to more control. When plans don't work as expected, the solution is usually more rules, more pressure, and more punishment. Instead of admitting the plan was wrong, authorities blame individuals for not obeying properly. Over time, the freedom shrinks, not all at once, but step by step. George Orwell feared a form of collectivism that demands loyalty to the group or ideology above honesty and human decency. For him, the danger was not sharing resources, but surrendering human conscience. Collectivism often changes the meaning of language. Words like freedom, justice, and equality are redefined to serve the collective goal. When language is controlled, thoughts follow. If people are forced to repeat slogans instead of speaking plainly, they lose the ability to recognize lies. When a society cannot say what is true, it cannot remain free.